Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to this month's webinar. And today we have Dr. Claire Nelson with us, who's going to talk about advancing smart futures for the global sustainability. Dr. Claire is a leading futurist of the Futures Forum, an advisory practice specializing in strategic foresight and sustainability engineering. She's also CEO of Ideation, a startup in the clean energy and space economy, and author of Smart Futures for a Flourishing World, a paradigm shift for achieving global sustainability. A Renaissance woman, she was named among Forbes' top 50 female futurists and has been honored as a White House champion of change. We're so happy to have you, Dr. Claire Nelson, and welcome. Take it away.
Thank you for having me. I am delighted to be here, and we'll jump right in to the future. So we're here to talk about smart futures. How do we cultivate smart futures for a flourishing world? And this comes from a book I wrote during the height of the COVID pandemic, Smart Futures for a Flourishing World, a paradigm shift for achieving global sustainability. I've been talking about futures for a long time, because having worked in the Interoperate Investment Bank, I've been thinking about how do we create planetary consciousness. And so my one-on-one show, Moon Runnings, where I tell the life and times of the first Jamaican on the moon, is set on the moon, so I could tell the story of human flourishing from the perspective of outer space, where we have the overview effect, where I could really see how I could benefit from the lessons I've learned in change making as what I call a conjure woman. And I say conjure woman because it has elements of, spirituality. It has elements of myth in the way we do change. Change of big system of systems is not something you can do in a linear way. So in my book, I talk about Imagine the year 2100. How might we reimagine human rights in a spacefaring civilization when we have by then have settlements on the moon and on Mars, and we have robots having rights, and we have AI as a fundamental part of what it means to be human if the transhumanist movement has their way. As I think about the future that I'm working to create, I want you to think about yourself and the future you want to create. And what is that one thing that you're working on that you really wish you could see more clearly what that outcome would look like, so that you can improve the steps you take to get from here to there, to get from what I consider the state of future shock, where we find ourselves bedeviled by the various challenges we're facing, and to the state of future sense, where we're able to look out on the emerging landscape and see the signals of change, watch the trends that are emerging. So as I said earlier, we are in a state of unrest. Challenges abound. If it's not flooding in Australia, if it's not wildfires in California, there's disaster of disasters happening both at the man-made level and at the natural level. And we feel to ourselves to be a planet in peril and a world in peril. And it is as if to say, some of us are in a state of denial. We're continuing to do business as usual, and then not recognizing that if all of us don't get in the boat on spaceship Earth, if all of us don't see ourselves as crew, we're not going to make that shift we need to make. Is it a state of future shock? I want to think that it is. Alvin Toffler made that phrase most popular. But the fact is, if you think about the amount of devices you have and the amount of emails that you have to attend to and the amount of ways you get your news, you have to agree with me that it's just so much information overload that half the time you have to ignore what it is that you are seeing, and then sometimes you miss what you really want to see because it's just too much. How can we then do something to make a difference, to make that shift, to make that paradigm shift we must make if we want to move from the economic growth paradigm, which has brought us into this VUCA world stage we're in, a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world that we're in, to a world that is thriving, a future that is flourishing, where humans and nature and the embediments of nature in which we live are really working for our common good. The mega trends of change that are driving our collapse, so to speak, in the Anthropocene. The flow to global, where we understand we're becoming citizens of a global community, a global economy, and not just individual countries. The flow to the individual, where we all, well, not all, but at least over 5 billion of us walk around with smartphones in our hands, and the fact that we're more and more connected. And this connectedness is part of what's driving what is being called the fourth industrial revolution. That complex, that fusion of advances in AI and robotics and Internet of Things and 3D printing and genetic engineering and nanotechnology and quantum computing that is driving the way everything happens in our lives, whether it be water management, energy management, politics, media. The fourth industrial revolution has both promise and peril. And yes, it can bring some quality of life to things like our healthcare system, and it can quality of life in terms of how we are educated, but it also can leave people behind. And that is one of the biggest issues and challenges facing our societies, as we see that inequality gap widening. And if you look at Sustainable Development Goal 10, which is inequality, we see that not many people have been able to wrap their head around what would it take to change economic structure that we know and make something different. If you imagine then 2070, when we're celebrating 100th anniversary of Earth Day, what might that look like? Will we have achieved the SDGs by then? Because there are some people who are saying, well, the SDGs won't happen until 2085. And I'm like, oh, really? By that time, we'll be all toast. What we need to do is focus right now on changing the economic paradigm so that we can get to the safe, just space for all. That space between the ecological ceiling of the 9 planetary boundaries and within the social foundation, which we have agreed as a human family, human civilization, that with the nature of human rights, and we are now having the right to a clean environment, that 5P argument, people, planet, prosperity, partnerships, and peace. With the 5 Ps, we need to create the safe, just space for all humanity wherein more of us can thrive. I would not say that all of us will thrive, but certainly more of us will thrive. We need to really mind the SDGs in a new way, get more people engaged, not just the people in government and the people in a couple of NGOs, but more people need to see this as a part and reason for their lives. 17 SDGs, 169 targets, and some of us are even talking about making space sustainability the 18th SDG. Whatever you want to take an angle that you are involved in, the mining industry, the energy industry, the water industry, I think we all will agree that what we're looking for is a future of well-being. There's much agreement that the GDP and GNP no longer measure what is important for the 21st century. And that indeed, the drivers of change, the technology, those technologies that are driving Industry 4.0, AI and VR and AR and cybersecurity and robotics, all of these drivers of change are really hurtling our route to self-destruction, self-annihilation, to self-extinction, if you will. The industries of the future that we want to think about then are the space economy, AI systems management, smart manufacturing or mining, synthetic biology, huge, gamification of everything, and of course, electrical vehicles, be it cars, trucks, trains, and airplanes even. All of these things are being contemplated and being researched. But whichever, again, angle you look at it, we can all agree that a major shift that is happening, which we don't seem to be able to figure out how it will emerge, is the idea of AI driving the world we live in. Manufacturing, healthcare, education, service. All of that is changing the future. I like to ask the question, what is the future we want? And when I say we, I'm talking about our personal, family, community, local, state, national, global future. And when I talk about future, I am not talking about just tomorrow or next month, but I'm talking about next 10 years, the next 20 years, because if you're looking at a system on which you have to set the life cycle, typically you're looking 10, 15, 20, 30 years out. And depending on what you're building, you may even be looking at 40 years out. And this future could be the social future, technological future, environmental, economical, political, legal, ethical, anthropological. All of it is the future. And that safe just space for humanity, that future, many people are now looking to say that should really be an economy which is regenerative, that goes beyond, as I said, the GDP as the driver and growth, recognizes growth that it could be actually cancerous. No natural system grows forever. That's considered a cancer. So we have to move to a different economy where we now use nature and the principle of nature and biomimicry for designing the economic systems. Now we're far away from that. These 8 principles are out there for us to study and learn, but we're certainly in a state of transition. And in this transitional period, I am among many of those who like to think that the SDGs can be a bridge to this new economy. And certainly for those of us who are thinking about the circular economy as another point of entry, moving towards a culture of restoration, reduce, reuse, recycle, restore. The future we need are definitely well-being futures, an economy of well-being where we can create a virtuous cycle that can drive economic prosperity and stability and resilience. And move towards shifting our national metrics from GDP as the god and the altar on which we sacrifice our future. The futures we need will be one where we have an international system of sustainable standards, such as that being contemplated by the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is building on all the tools we've been using and the reporting frameworks in the last 4, 5, 10, 15 years, and coming up with something that is translational or can be translated across different sectors and different societies and different countries, small, local, large, multinational, global economies. The futures we need have to be such that we are based on the principles, again, of natural systems driving us to take the right fork based on the fact we're at a fork in our road where we want to move from survival, which is continuing business as usual despite our challenges, to thrival, where we're able to really flourish, to feel better, do better, and ensure that nature is able to restore itself in a way that keeps our natural systems moving. Well, look at 2050, which is a big D-date for the climate change movement. And I think about a group like the Arctic Sea Commission. I think about what might that headline read? Will we see that all the ice floes have melted and there's now a passage over which a war has been fought? Or will we have come up with solutions to share that emerging space in a different way? The futures we might look out at are possible, are preferable, are plausible. What we want to concern ourselves with as people who are in the business of making change and co-creating change is our preferable futures, the ones that we co-create. And we want to use a futures approach to look out at how we design our products or programs or processes or plans and our policies, because we all want to live in a future that we desire. And we recognize that we co-create the future. So yes, we are making designs based on past history, but our design is for future that we want to live in. And so we have to develop a history of that preferred future so our systems can move towards a shared vision of a future. What is the future you want? And can you imagine for yourself a day in your life in 2030? How old will you be? What will you be doing? For me, I imagine myself on my way to the moon as an activist in the United Planetary Society to assure the rights to space, which, if my luck turns out, will be formed sometime in the next 2 years. In 2045, the UN turns 100. Can you imagine? And I'm thinking about if the human rights agenda has already morphed into the environmental rights agenda, and we have robots and AI, what will the UN look like at that time? What new agencies will exist? As it stands, the UN is now thinking about putting in place a global foresight capacity because of the fact that so many of our challenges are borderless and boundaryless. And we need new ways of dealing with these global challenges if we are to make the right decisions about how we share our planet, how we share our oceans, etc. Our mission then is to get to training leaders so that they can better recognize the future, better analyze the future, and better co-create the future. That is the mission that we ought to be about as change makers and change agents. And certainly for those of you in the life cycle business, the leaders that you have to work with also have to be educated as part of this process. And so my smart futures paradigm is about looking at the things that make up these processes, these spaces, the policies, plans, processes, products, and programs that are the fundamental building blocks of the material reality that we are creating. And that change systems we're talking about, from STEEP, the traditional STEEP, social, technology, environmental, economic, and political, to also the anthropological ways in which humans themselves are changing, and the fact that our laws are not keeping up with our technologies, and the ethical choices we have to make, and the fact that we are in a demographic blitz where one half of the world is aging and one half of the world is still very, very young. And so the smart futures paradigm is about asking smart questions of the future, asking questions about S, sustainable systems, M, meaningful metrics, A, anticipatory agency, R, robust resilience, and T, transformative use of technology, or transformational use of technology. The smart futures paradigm is really a framework for design thinking that I think and I hope that we'll be able to catch on across a broad base of people. As I said earlier, it's 5 questions that I'm saying, if more people can ask these 5 questions, whether they're a life cycle analytic person or foresight expert or ESG expert or sustainable metric expert, if I can get more people to just understand that, and we think about smart cars and smart houses and smart cities, we need to think about them from the point of view of what does it mean to be really smart. So if S means that we're designing for sustainable systems and people are asking that question no matter what they're designing, perhaps we'll get to a better design of that thing that they're working on in cities or in countries or in companies. If that M is smart is about meaningful metrics, and we're looking at designing a new policy for seabed mining, a new hot thing on the market, perhaps we might recognize that those metrics might mean we ought not to be mining the seabed in islands like those in Caribbean region. This is my current pet peeve I'm about to launch a one-woman war against. A is about aspirational agency, recognizing that every agent in the ecosystem or the design has its own aspirations and its own view of the future that they would like to get to or design or living. And we have to take that into account when we're crafting our scenarios and what under which we're going to make a design choice. We have to design for robust resilience. How is this plan or this product or this process designed for resilience in the case of a shock? And how long will it take for the system to right itself if something happens and in fact it gets broken? These concepts are critical if we're talking about creating a smart future. And of course, as I said earlier, transformational technology means that you want to use technology, not just because it's shiny and pretty and everybody wants to have a techno utopia, but because it's actually going to transform the quality of life, the well-being of people's lives. And we move away from the assumption that technology necessarily means brighter, but looking at both the positive and negative aspects of technology and its impact on our lives as humans. So how smart are your plans for the future, the programs you're designing? And how can we get more people to internalize these smart questions and moving away that they can become evolutionary in the way they're leading their companies and their NGOs and their cities and their states? Smart futures is also about understanding that there's a value system by which we're making these design choices, right? And people don't often think about the values, but the fact is that there are value systems that we have to be thinking about when we think about smart futures. How might we look at the principle of solidarity, bearing in mind our need to tap into our spiritual intelligence so we don't keep on designing more efficient ways to deconstruct or to self-destruct. The principle of mutuality, right? We recognize human relationships as interdependent. As the Zulu word goes, Ubuntu, recognizing that I am because we are, that we don't make our own clothes or grow our own food. And we use moral intelligence to create laws in society that reflect this idea of interdependence. What about altruism? Can we really get to the stage where more people can do things for the well-being of others? Is this the role of the company to not just make a profit for its shareholders, but to be concerned about the well-being of its stakeholders, those who may not be getting any capital benefits from the profits they make? What about reciprocity? And it's not about the transactional nature of reciprocity where you scratch my back, I scratch yours, but understanding that what you do to others may not necessarily come back from the same person, but reciprocity means that there's an intelligence in the system that what you do for others comes back to you from another source. And trusting in this principle, the principle of trust itself, that in fact, this idea about law, being a society of law and order, recognize that we have to trust in something and the law in which we trust. But how do we take account of trust that must take account of the future and write laws that take into account that we want to leave water and energy and soil that is healthy for the future generations to come? How do we create a better bedrock of trust for that? So how smart are our values and the values that are embedded in the systems that we're designing, whether they be plans, products, processes, or programs? When I think about 2040, I think a lot about the book Ministry of the Future, and I think about what Wales is doing, which is Futures Generations Commission, and what we see happening in New Zealand and Iceland and other countries, where they're beginning to really put in place laws and policies and regulations that look out into the future and test our willingness to, quote unquote, deny ourselves something now so that our children might have it later. And this idea of building community around these ideas, creating a movement, the word I'm using is movementology here, is about getting more people to be embedded in this work that is about creating the future we want. That's about creating flourishing futures and smart futures and what I'm terming as zoetic futures, life affirming, meaning moving away from this idea that technology necessarily means brighter and shinier, and having some future images that also would have a beach in it and a mountain. I just can't stand the fact that most future images are about lights and tall buildings and dark skies. It's almost like we're forgetting that we can also write a different picture or picture this differently. And so, yes, we might see genes as commerce and AI and those things, but we want to also have a picture of a green and bright future, not as a dark and dystopian future like most of the Hollywood movies seem to create. So the question is, how can we make the change? And more importantly, can we be the change that we have been waiting for? I think the people in this community definitely see themselves as change makers. Your work is about helping companies to make those changes. And perhaps your work ought to be also about helping the people in those companies to see themselves as change makers, to recognize that the power to change doesn't just reside in the person in charge of ESG, but the person also in charge of human resources, recognizing that we all are in this together. And for the Smart Futures Program is about recognizing that everybody is a change maker, everybody is a leader, and everybody is also a follower. Because at some aspect in our life, we're following behind someone else, and in some aspect of our life, we're leading others. So we have to bring all of ourselves, our whole systems, our whole mental and emotional system into our role as leader. Smart Futures for me then is about getting support to explore more futures, to create more participatory workshops with different communities, to create games that can be played, to create a series of films that can be shared, to crowdsource also books about the future, smart futures that can enable a groundswell of, in my big dream, 10 million people, just as only less than 10% of people who have a smartphone, to understand smart in the same way that I'm using the word as an acronym for sustainability, for meaningful metrics, for aspirational agency, for robust resilience, and for transformational use of technology. As we imagine this future we want to think about healing the future, not just in the generic sense of the healthcare as I have on the slide here, which talks about telehealth for small islands, but healing the future for our thrival as a species. What is important is that we need to have a common story of the shared future that is not utopian. I don't believe in utopian, but certainly that is protopian, that some people are calling it, or I call it normatopia, a normal future with good, bad, and indifferent, but certainly one in which we're thriving. We know that story works because we listen to audio shows and we watch web videos and we might be dreaming about fantasy vacations. We're telling ourselves stories all the time. We know that story works because research tells us our brain lights up. Different parts of our brain lights up when we hear stories. It's not the same as when we hear data and information and only two parts of your brain light up. In story, our attention to smell and visual, all these different elements of our brain light up. And we remember complex ideas much easier when told in story form. Story is important because it helps to build community. It's fun to tell stories. Yes, some stories are sad, that's true. But the fact is, it's fun to tell stories about the future we want. When you go into a company and you're trying to create a vision of what it is this project will take them to. Can we tell a story of life lived in the presence of this project, which is positive and aspirational and makes people feel good about that which they're working on? Stories help people to understand the nature of their own experience. When we share our personal story, our story about how we view the world, other people begin to see themselves in that story and begin to see how their vision of the future coincides with yours. Now, there are all kinds of stories we can tell. Creation stories, value stories about how the company's values are making a difference, striving to improve stories. If the company makes a mistake and wants to say, well, we did bad, however, we're going to do better. And there are also stories that should be told from different perspectives. So it's not just the story of the manager in the company, but it could be the story of the human resource person in the company that is moving this issue along, or even the anti-hero in the story that has made you do something different other than what you planned to move ourselves forward. When I think about life cycle analysis, there are many kinds of stories from the future you might be telling yourself or should be telling yourself right now. For example, how do we customize new metrics around solar power from space? How do we use AI to sort of enable the design of waste management systems in island nations where, you know, the distance between land and sea is so small? So much things to do to make a difference. But again, the most important question to ask is, can we make the change? And can we be the change? Where are these seeds of change that we need to plant in order to co-create our global sustainability? As you think about the story of our shared future, the one that the SDGs and the climate change movements are trying to create, what is your story as a life cycle expert? And what's the gap between the stories that you're sharing with your clients and your organizations and the future that you as an individual or as an expert in this space wants? Can we find a common story among ourselves in this tribe that is called a life cycle assessment community? Is there a common story that you are now sharing about what it is that you have made happen for 2030, for 2040, for 2050? And does that story impact just your local community, or does it impact the state or the nation or the world? Shirley Chisholm said, you don't make progress by standing on the sidelines, whimpering and complaining. You make progress by implementing ideas. So what ideas are you implementing in order to make that shift? What can you do while others sit around and wait and complain? I recognize that meeting the SDGs might just be a wish and a fantasy for many. And perhaps in 2030, the headline will read that we're extending the SDGs to 2040 because countries, yes, have moved forward, but not enough has been done to get us to where we need to be to ensure that we co-create the future of flourishing we want. So again, I ask the question, are you ready to be the change? Recognizing that the world is ours and we are the world. We're in this together. Ubuntu, I am because you are. We're interdependent. So I invite you to get smart with me, to remember that the future is embedded in the landscape of both past and present, and that the future favors the bold. So go out and seize this day, seize the opportunity, and face our shared future with faith. I am grateful for this opportunity to speak to you about my paradigm, the Smart Futures paradigm. And I hope, along with me, you recognize, as Indigenous people say, the earth does not belong to us. We belong to the earth. And I have changed that to say, the cosmos do not belong to us as we go out and try to create a space economy, but we belong to the cosmos. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Oh my goodness. Thank you for such an inspiring talk, Dr. Claire. And we have questions from the audience. And other people have reiterated that it was inspiring, and someone asked, could you share an example of meaningful metrics in your view?
Meaningful metrics for me and my big, I guess, platform I'm trying to get started, certainly for small island nations, is to move away from gross national product and GDP to well-being. The OECD countries have done a lot of work, they have a framework, but for some reason it's not moving as fast, maybe because of hundreds of years of using one metric. But a meaningful metric of well-being would be more useful to cultivating this community of practice across different borders and boundaries. And so because it's already there and already being thought through, and a rich framework of data and indicators exists, for me, the most meaningful metric that I would like to see nations like my island nation of Jamaica do is move towards a well-being as a important metric on which the national plans are designed.
Thank you. We have someone who says, I understand that we can use LCA to access the sustainability of what I'm designing, but how can we access the A in SMART?
All right, so agency. When you're looking at a project that you're working in, think about the ecosystem of that project. Let's see, if we're doing a mining project, for example, you have the engineers in the mining project, you have the people who live around the mines, you have the people who are going to benefit as suppliers to the mines or going to be suppliers from the mines. So it's a whole ecosystem. Most times we don't really look at all the people who are affected. So the agents, first of all, are the first order agents, and then you have the second order agents that are impacted. Then you have the third order agents. I think because of the fact that we've made so many mistakes. In Jamaica, for example, we have a bauxite lake that's just sitting there. Nobody's doing anything about it. It's just there. More recently, we had a chemical spill in a river, right? And so people are now up in arms because the government wants to open new mining in a very delicate area of our ecosystem. My argument is that they have not really looked at all the agents in that system, including the future agents, because where they want to do the mining is where a water table is. Our limestone water feeds the river. So if you mine there and you pollute that, what's going to happen to people 5, 10, 15 years from now? So the agents in our system will not just be those who are there now, but the descendants of those that might be impacted by our work.
Okay, thank you. One of our listeners asks if degrowth will be a solution.
You know, I've not really wrapped my head about the idea of degrowth, because what does that mean? I mean, nothing living, well, it's dying if it's degrowing, right? In the living system, degrowth means you're dying. If you're not growing, you're dying. So I like, in the terms of the economy, to use the word either circular economy or restorative economy, and to think about if we were to actually use a well-being metric as opposed to growth, then first of all, our agenda would be different. And if the engineers can get it right, if we can really get more engineers, and one of the things I'm working on is a community of trying to get sustainability literacy embedded in every engineer that is graduated by the year 2030. It's a big project, and American Society for Engineering, American Association for Engineering Education is a big part of that. Also Engineering for One Planet. And so we're looking at this idea of making more engineers. So you have the economists who have to change their metrics, the engineers have to change their way of design, and the finance people. But economics, I think, is what's driving it. So if we can get that metric to shift from GDP as the gospel to which we almost adhere and move towards well-being, I think we'll be well on our way. So I think rather than degrowth, I want to focus on well-being as a metric.
Thank you. And another listener asks where they can get a copy of your book, but I see that you put up on Amazon. Is that really where they should go for that?
Yes, it's on Amazon. It's on Amazon.
And another question is, what can I do within my company to get people imagining the future they want? Are there good questions to ask?
Yes, you can have like a lunch and learn session, right? You could start sometimes with a movie, if a movie is about the future, like if you think it's a popular movie that's out there, that is reflective of the region that you're in or the sector that you're in. That's one way to open it. So you could have a lunch and learn around a movie or a science fiction book, or a book like mine, which is not a science fiction book. My book is different from most books because it has stories in there. And my book is set up where I have a mythology, which is how humans save themselves from self-extinction. Because I believe that right now we're in that border state of either hurtling over the precipice to disaster or holding back and turn around. And it's the work of people like yourself and those of us in the sustainability engineering movement that are going to have to work together in new ways to create a broader network of people moving with one goal. Even though we're working on different things, we're moving with one shared story. And so I think a lunch and learn is the best way, because it's not going to feel like, oh no, I got to go to this workshop. You know, people get so irritated. Make it fun first, and then you sneak it in through the back door. If you make it the thing that they have to do, most times you get such resentment. One last thing, if it is that your company decides, you know what, everybody has to do this, whatever you do, make it fun. Make it a lot of fun and use story. Help them see themselves in their story. If they have children, help them think about their children's future. If they have grandchildren, what will your grandchild be doing in 2040? My Lord, have you thought about it? Well, I want me here, I don't care. But your granddaughter will be here. What kind of water do you want them to drink? So that's the way to get people to get in by making it personal. And then from the personal, you go to the systems in which you're embedded. And the beauty of it is that we're embedded in everything, because we all eat, we all drink water, we all sleep, we all need healthcare, we all need to be educated. So we're in everything.
Okay, I have another question for who are your favorite storytellers right now who are speaking or writing about the futures they want?
Well, I have to say, Ministry of the Future is now my Bible, so maybe that's my favorite storyteller. That book was such a powerful book for the work I am doing in global sustainability, and I've been rereading it right now to see how could we actually make it happen. I'm kind of obsessed with that. Going back in the past, I would say perhaps my other big influence is Star Trek. I mean, it's almost weird to say, I'm sure it shows you how old I am, right? But now that I'm involved in the space economy and have a startup called Irradiance, which is looking at doing solar energy in space and wireless solar power, the question is, is my future like a Star Trek future where, you know, humans are still living and in the year 5000 we have survived because we've made the right choices now? And I think those are the two ones that really drive a lot of the embedded mythology by which I work.
Okay, thank you. One more question. This is, why do you think this idea of smart futures would catch on if more people thought about it?
Well, because we all have a smartphone. So I have said very clearly, I'm not interested in a certification in smart futures. What I'm interested in is people just thinking, oh, smart means these things. You know, like how you think, you know, what does, you know, like when you're doing SMART goals, it says SMART is strategic. So if I can get more people to think about futures, not just goals, because goals are very much tactical, but futures are kind of aspirational and strategic, right? So moving from goals to futures, first of all, so you're looking at a strategy on long-term impact, first, second, third order impact, and then SMART, meaning not just strategy, but the SMART. So the acronym was mean for something different. So you don't have to necessarily go to get a certificate in smart futures thinking to do the work, but it's just a part of the way you think naturally, like you count 1, 2, 3. So my dream is to, you know, get it onto an app or a diagram or a story or a TikTok or something that makes it more fun and makes it more accessible than a book. And certainly also for people who are working on Teach the Future, which is a whole movement around teaching in colleges and teaching in high schools, teach the future, seeing how I can maybe make a young version of this so the young people coming up would not just, every time they think about a smartphone, they will think the word smart futures. What does it mean?
Right. Well, as we said earlier, it's been quite the inspiring talk. We want to thank you so much for talking with us, and for not just for talking with us, but for all the work you do and all the inspiration you give to all the other people out there. And we're with you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
So thank you all for joining. Take care now.